Hi friends, welcome to Chapter 5, Communicator Characteristics and Persuasion. In this lecture, we'll cover three sections. The first section will cover demographic variables and persuasion. In section 2, we'll take a dive into the psychological and communication states and traits of a target audience. And in section 3, we'll discuss how to go about analyzing and adapting to our audience. So let's go ahead and get started first with demographics. So when developing a persuasive message, we want to take into consideration the demographics of the audience. And by doing so, we take an audience-centeredness approach. And this approach essentially is keeping the audience foremost in mind at every step of the preparation and the presentation of a persuasive message. So we know that persuasion seeks a desired response from the intended audience. And in order to seek a desired response from the audience, we first have to know how to achieve that response. And knowing how to achieve that desired response is rooted in understanding the audience. Understanding the audience includes understanding the demographic variables and also, as we will soon find out, the psychological predispositions of the audience. Essentially, we want to think about how can we, as a persuasive communicator, adapt to the audience. And being able to adapt, we're going to have to know as much as we possibly can of the audience so that we can tailor our message to fit their needs. So some of the standard demographic variables that we might want to assess or to measure or to gain information on will include age. So whether or not this is a specific persuasive message tailored to a target audience. This might include crafting a message that is going to resonate to a particular age group. Or if we're, let's say given a presentation where the audience may include members of different age ranges, we want to understand, those age ranges. How many of our participants will be, part of a younger generation versus an older generation. Educational level will influence their knowledge on a topic potentially. Gender, we know that there are some gender differences in persuadability. We might want to know their socioeconomic status in terms of what's going to motivate people to pay attention or be persuaded by a message, and this could relate to the socioeconomic status. Political party affiliation will determine, again, values in society, race and ethnicity, and then also religion. So these are some just standard demographic variables that if we're crafting a persuasive message, we want to know how old our participants are or the target audience we're trying to reach, their education, their gender, the socioeconomic status, political party affiliation if it's relevant, race, ethnicity, because we do see some cultural variations in persuasion, and then again, religion if it's pertained to the topic. And primarily because we assess religion is because a lot of people find value or some of their strong held beliefs may stem from a particular religious viewpoint. So let's go ahead and first talk about age. We know through research that some age groups are more susceptible to influence than others. Particularly children and the elderly are more susceptible to persuasion. So children are not as cognitively developed as adults, such as yourself and myself. They're less adept at resisting advertisements. So children are still developing their cognitive awareness, their cognitive abilities, and oftentimes they cannot distinguish between what is, information, like purely factual information, what is an advertisement trying to get them to buy a particular toy. we know that children are more easily swayed by lures. So the textbook offers an in-depth explanation of some of the dangers of persuasion as it relates to children. So I wanted to give two brief examples. The first one is Blippi. Um, so after babysitting my nephew for a couple of times, he was always wanting to watch Blippi, and so I was like, okay, I have no idea what Blippi is, but sure, let's go ahead and check it out. And then soon after, I found myself captivated in the content that Blippi was sharing. So essentially, Blippi, is this young guy who just creates these educational, silly videos for kids and posts them on YouTube. So surprisingly enough, he started doing this for his own nieces and nephews. Currently, his net worth is $18 million for just, again, making silly videos for kids. So we see that, the appeal of Blippi is definitely being monetized. He's definitely catering his content to fit a particular age demographic. We see that Ryan's Toys Reviews, again, another huge YouTube channel, recently faced a lawsuit of $170 million, where the FTC launched this lawsuit against YouTube, primarily because Ryan's Toys Reviews was using sponsored content as a form of advertisement, product placement, without disclosing in that content that they were being subsidized or paid, or this content was sponsored. Primarily because, again, some ethical questions arise in terms of, children and advertisements. Children aren't fully aware that maybe they're being manipulated or swayed or persuaded in order to buy a particular. We know that elderly also may experience cognitive decline. So we see that while Blippi in Ryan's Toys Reviews might not be targeting an elderly population to get their message across or to persuade them, we do see other people taking advantage of the elderly, and this could include scammers. And one of the reasons why scammers target the elderly is due to maybe a sense of loneliness that sometimes accompanies elderly people. Oftentimes, elderly people may have a nest egg or large savings, or maybe that they're on a fixed income. And so the elderly may be motivated to engage in these scammers, especially if they promise some sort of profit or an increase in monetary value. So we see that the elderly are also susceptible to persuasion. This is taken into consideration by the life stages hypothesis, and this is essentially where we see a curvier linear relationship between age and gullibility. So a circular linear relationship is when a variable decreases over time, but then it hits this critical point in time where the variable starts to then increase. And so we see that gullibility is high among children because, again, their cognitive abilities are still being developed. But as we grow as adults, we learn through experiences, we learn how to decipher information. And so as adults, we're pretty low in this gullibility. But once again, this variable increases, the gullibility increases as we get older in approaching the golden years of our lives, right? And so you see here on the left, life alert, help, I've fallen, I can't get up, those persuasive messages targeted to older people, and, maybe trying to use fear as a motivation to buy a product. Let's go ahead and talk about gender and persuasion. The book offers an extensive discussion on gender and how it relates to persuasion. So we do see some gender differences in persuasion. Males tend to be more persuasive than females, not because of the male's ability or skills. So keep in mind that while, yes, society generally views males as more persuasive than females, it's not because males are inherently better at persuasion or they have better skills. In fact, it's usually the opposite. So gender stereotypes cause audience to perceive males as more competent than females, and to expect females to be warmer and nurturing than females. So this is really rooted in some of these stereotypical gender norms. We see women experience this double bind when it comes to persuasion. So they must not only perform better than men in order to stand out or to be considered equally competent, but they are also perceived negatively when they try to be direct, assertive, and forceful. So again, double standards, when it comes to this. This is explained by reinforcement expectancy theory, which suggests that when influencing patients, female doctors, for example, compared to male doctors, are at a disadvantage because they are constrained by stereotypes regarding appropriate influence tactics for females. So this reinforcement expectancy theory may take into consideration why we see some gender differences. So early studies indicate that women were more persuadable than men, but later studies find no such difference between men and women. So we're equally persuaded by messages around us. So if gender differences in persuadability are observed, it may be because of the following. One, women may be more empowered today than they were in previous studies were conducted. So, we're at a different standpoint or a different time in history where the gender gap is slowly declining. So another reason why this may be the case is the cross-sex effect, in which people are more persuaded by members of the opposite sex than by members of the same sex. And third, men and women may differ in terms of their goals, their plans, their beliefs, and their resources, and these in turn may lead to gender differences in persuasion. So let's go ahead and briefly discuss culture, ethnicity, and so we see two broad categories when it comes to cultural dynamics. The first is individualistic cultures, and the second are collectivistic cultures. In individualistic cultures, these cultures tend to value independence, individual autonomy, and individual goals. They're very much focused on individual success. These countries or cultures are usually persuaded by appeals to individual benefits. Essentially, when we consume persuasive messages or advertisements or look at a product, we're thinking to ourselves, what's in it for me? Like, how is this product, service is going to benefit me in my life? And typically we're persuaded by messages that really accentuate the individual benefits. Personal success, how does this message relate to my success? Essentially, you're probably paying attention to this presentation, or maybe even you're paying attention to your academic journey because, again, your personal success is contingent on how well you perform in college. So these cultures, these individualistic cultures, are usually persuaded by those individual benefits, how it relates to personal success, and often very direct strategies. However, in collectivistic cultures where the group is more important than the individual, these cultures tend to value harmony, concern for others, group goals over personal goals. Subsequently, they're going to be persuaded a little bit different. They're going to be persuaded by appeals to the group benefit and not necessarily the individual benefits. So they're probably thinking, how will this product, the service, this persuasive message benefit the group? They often respond well to appeals to authority, consensus, liking, and reciprocity. In addition, they often they respond to appeals to group-controlled sanctions. So there's often a fear of social isolation or ostracization from a group. And so they usually respond to persuasive messages that essentially have the power to enact some sort of controlled sanctions. So oftentimes, individuals from a collectivistic culture are persuaded by indirect strategies such as hinting. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the psychological and communication states and traits as it relates to persuasion. So let's first look at the psychological states and traits. Essentially, traits are characteristics, patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that generalize across similar situations and remain rather stable across time. So these are traits. These are innate to who you are, and they're pretty consistent straight across the board, right? So we could look at anxiety, trait level anxiety, for example. And this is where anxiety is persistent in an individual's life straight across the board. Doesn't matter if they're giving a presentation or if they're in a social situation or waiting in the doctor's office, they're going to experience this trait level anxiety, this high level of anxiety in all dimensions of life. However, we see that states are characteristics of patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving in a concrete situation at a specific moment in time. So let's say maybe you don't have trait anxiety, but if you were to maybe go to your dental appointment, your anxiety levels would increase because that is a common situation where people feel anxiety is visiting the dentist, right? And so we see that in the graph to the right, this is anxiety scores moments before participants went into a dentist's office, right? So state anxiety would be anxiety associated to a particular situation. So maybe you don't have any anxiety associated with communicating, only except when you're in front of a class presenting a class presentation. Then that would be state anxiety. So think about these traits and states. Traits, again, are consistent straight across the board. They're stable, whereas states are, again, situational. So let's go ahead and take a look at the psychology of the audience. We know that people's self-esteem, their self-evaluations, can influence how they experience persuasion. So we see that high self-esteem persons are more receptive to persuasion, but may resist to yield to that persuasive attempt. So high self-esteem people essentially are receptive. They are in tune. They know when they're being persuaded. But because they feel maybe confident or they have a positive self-evaluation, they may resist that persuasive attempt. Whereas people with low self-esteem are less receptive to persuasion, so they aren't as in tune to the persuasion, primarily because individuals with low self-esteem are preoccupied with maybe their own self-image and deciding whether or not they're fitting into a particular situation. So they're less receptive to persuasion. However, they're more likely to yield to a persuasive message because, again, maybe they want to fit in or they want, maybe that reinforcement or affirmation. And so they tend to, again, yield to persuasive messages. So moderate esteemed individuals are more likely to receive and yield to a persuasive message. Anxiety, this is the psychological stress and arousal that we experience in certain situations, or maybe straight across the board if it's trait anxiety. We see that low anxious individuals may be less vulnerable to anxiety arousing messages. So, if you're trying to use fear or FOMO, for example, fear of missing out, as a persuasive tactic to motivate your audience to, let's say, take advantage of a sale or buy a product or take action regarding climate change or change some sort of health. If individuals have low anxiety, these messaging strategies might not work. However, high anxious persons may be more vulnerable, but again, less receptive, right? So that's anxiety and psychological stress and arousal. We see consistency. This is the congruence between attitudes and behavior is important. So different levels of preference for consistency can influence the process of persuasion, right? So we all have preferences for our attitudes and behaviors. So people who have a high preference for consistency strive to be consistent and are often more susceptible to the effects of cognitive dissonance. And again, that's a concept that we learned previously. Self-monitoring. This is essentially the extent of awareness and regulation of one's own behavior. We see that high self-monitors more responsive to social reward and image-based ads. So self-monitors have a high need to tailor their communication in order to fit into a situation. And so they're more motivated by social rewards and image-based ads. Like, is this product going to make me look better, right? So, buying that teeth whitening toothpaste because everyone wants a brilliant smile. People who are high self-monitors and value that are going to be more persuaded by that. Whereas low self-monitors, these individuals are essentially they're consistent with who they are straight across the board. They don't really tailor their behavior or their communication to match the situation. They're essentially their authentic self despite the situation. So low self-monitors, more responsive to message content and their own judgments. So they aren't really concerned about social rewards or the image-based ads and how these ads are going to make their life better. They're more concerned with the actual validity of an argument or the content of a message and their own judgment for that matter. So we could also take into consideration social judgment theory. So social judgment and ego involvement, how important an issue is to our self-identity. So we see that ego involvement, these individuals are motivated by a persuasive message or to pay attention to a persuasive message when there is a value relevant involvement that is tied to one's values and self-concept. So they have a need to pay attention to persuasive messages or be persuaded by messages when they're involved in an issue that is directly tied to their values or self-concept. However, we do see issue involvement. These are outcome relevant involvement. So people operating from this usually are tied to particular goals or outcomes. They're more concerned with, what's going to be the outcome. How is this persuasive message going to match the goals or intended outcome? So there's a correlation between ego involvement and extreme attitudes. So we see that high ego involvement have small latitude of acceptance and large latitude of rejection. So if you're trying to persuade individuals who have high ego involvement on taking a particular change, you would first want to figure out what their latitude of acceptance and rejection are. Low ego involvement have larger latitude of acceptance and a small latitude of rejection. High credibility can increase latitude of acceptance. So this is the basic premise of social judgment theory, that in any given situation or in a variety of different topics and opinions that we are faced with in everyday, people are going to have an anchor point. The anchor point is essentially what they seem as acceptable. And so if you're, let's say, using the example from the textbook, if you're trying to convince someone of enacting the death penalty on someone, you would first want to figure out, their ego involvement. Are they, value relevant involvement? Is it tied to one's value and self-concept? Are they firmly against or firmly for the death penalty? Because if so, and their ego is involved, chances are they're going to have a smaller latitude of acceptance for other positions. And we see that in this graph where their latitude of rejection is really big. They're going to probably reject every, persuasive attempt. And essentially you're operating in this narrow window trying to get their anchor point to move in either direction, whereas people who are issue involvement or maybe low in that ego involvement, they're going to have a larger latitude of acceptance. So they aren't really necessarily sure on maybe what they believe, and so they're susceptible to being persuaded to accept a larger range of possibilities. So they have a smaller latitude of rejection. So let's explore some other factors that the textbook presents, dogmatism and authoritarianism. So these are essentially when high values are associated with authority. These individuals tend to be closed-minded and tend to be influenced by high status authority rather than a message itself. So again, if someone is falling on the dogmatism, authoritarianism scale, they might respond well to very high credible or high status individuals or sources of information. We see that the book talks about social vigilantism, which perceive their beliefs as superior to other beliefs. They counter-argue more than their counterparts. They tend to dominate conversations and get emotionally upset, and they often engage in belittling others who disagree. We see that narcissism plays a factor in persuasion. Essentially, narcissism, they love themselves and have little concern for others, and are often persuaded by things that make them look better, stand out, or messages that are tailored to their conceit. We also see cognitive complexity functioning as a persuasive factor. Those who use more constructs to view the world around them are usually persuaded by quality arguments than those who have a low need for cognition, who are often persuaded by those peripheral cues as outlined in the elaboration likelihood model. Another point the book makes is this verbal argumentativeness versus verbal aggressiveness. So argumentativeness is a constructive form of assertiveness, whereas aggression is destructive. And so obviously, if a persuader is trying to use aggression, threats, name calling, belittling, these tactics don't really respond, people don't usually respond well to these aggressive attacks as a form of persuasion. In fact, what it usually does is alienates people or entrenches them in their attitudes and beliefs, right? And I think that's why we see so much political divide and the polarization within our country, is because the aggression that is often taking place directed towards the opposite side of the political spectrum. And essentially, if you're very aggressive and in your persuasive tactics, like, that's just going to push those people away from what you're trying to persuade them to do, right? So another interesting theory, and we won't necessarily get into this theory, but it's Foss and Griffin's invitational rhetoric, where the idea of rhetoric is to invite the other person to explore things from your point of view, and vice versa. And by creating a safe place where people can engage in dialogue, that's where actually persuasion can take place. Okay, so let's briefly touch on analyzing and adapting to the audience. So what does this all mean to us as it relates to persuasion. We talked about audience analysis, understanding the psychological components of communicators so that we can tailor a message. So much of persuasion resides in the ability to complete these 6 things. First, to analyze the audience and collect as much information about them as we possibly can. 2, view the world from the target audience's point of view. So again, that using that cognitive complexity and trying to understand, the other person's point of view and how they operate as a communicator, as someone living in the world. So if we know how people are viewing the world around them, then that gives us insight into their thought patterns, their behavior patterns, and then we, as a persuasive communicator, can tailor our message in a way that fits the frame or the viewpoints of the audience. Third, keep in mind how a message will fulfill an audience's needs. So the book briefly touches on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but essentially Maslow would structure human needs in a pyramid shape. The base of that pyramid are these physiological needs, like we all need food, water, shelter to be able to survive. And so humans have that basic physiological need in order for survival. Once we have completed those needs, then we move into these safety needs. Once we have the safety needs, once we feel secure, we have maybe shelter or home, then we move into these the next level of needs, and that's these belonging needs, like where we want to belong to some sort of group. We want to belong to in a relationship. We want to experience intimacy and connection with other people. And then once we have those needs fulfilled, then we move into the esteem needs, where we have a need for prestige and bettering ourselves and so forth. And then the top need is that self-actualization, which is essentially reaching one's fullest potential. So keep in mind how we tailor our messages and how they're going to match the audience's needs. And so we could use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to guide how we do that and which need that we target in order to package our. Fourth, adapt messages to meet the audience's values and beliefs. 5, adjust a message to audience's culture and gender. And then 6, consider personality traits when designing messages. So by doing this, what we really are doing is an audience analysis. Again, collecting as much information, data about a target group or the intended recipient of our message, so that we can again take all that information and make a strategic, calculated message that's going to respond well to our target audience. So in this brief presentation, we covered demographic variables and persuasion. We looked at some psychological and communication states and traits that are relevant to persuasion, and some things that we should consider when developing a persuasive messages. And lastly, we talked about 6 steps in analyzing and adapting to our audience. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.